Hi, in this video, we'll introduce the risk and return of the stocks. So we'll add a bit of uncertainty to the stock return here. Suppose I have stock A, which is currently trading at £100, and in the next period, there are three different possible states. For 50% of the probability here, the price is going to be £150. For 30% of probability, the price is going to be £120, and for the rest 20%, the price is £60. Okay, so we can first calculate the individual returns for each state. So for the first one, the return is 50%. The second one, the return is 20%, and the last one would be minus 40%. Okay, so what is the expected return or the average return for the stock? It is not the simple arithmetic average, which is by adding these three numbers up and divide by 3. That's not the average. We'll use the weighted average here, and the weight is the probability here. So it's the same way you would do in statistic problems here. Okay, so we would use 50% multiplied by 50%, which is the first case, and then 30% multiplied by 20%, which is the second case, and 20% of probability multiplied by minus 40%, which is the last case. Okay, and then you should have 23% as the average return or the expected return for this specific stock. Okay, so we have the return here, but how do we measure the risk? Okay, we would often use the standard deviation or sigma of the return as the risk of the stock. Okay, so how do we calculate the standard deviation? It is simply the square root of the variance of the returns. So we only need to calculate the variance and take the square root. Okay, so dealing with variance, it is still very similar to what we have learned in statistics here. So it's basically the probabilities multiplied by the deviation of each result from its average, but to the power of 2. Okay, so in this case, it would be the square root of 50% times 50% minus 23%. Okay, that's the first case, and its deviation from the average here, which is 23% to the power of 2, and plus 30%, second case, multiplied by 20%, minus 23% to the power of 2, and then 20%, okay, multiplied by minus 40% minus 23%. Okay, so that is how we calculate the standard deviation. So we first need a variance here. Okay, so now all we need to do is to plug in the numbers here. Okay, so you would have the square root of 0.1161. Okay, and that would give you 0.341 or 34.1%. Okay, and that is how we describe the risk of a stock. Okay, so we could generalize this into two formula here. Okay, so the expected return for any stock is basically the sum of each possible state. Let's call it PI with probability P here, and the return in that state. Okay, so the standard deviation for RA is simply, again, the summation of PI, but then each individual return minus the expected return, but to the power of 2. Okay, so that is very similar to what we have learned in statistics. Okay, so that is the case for a single stock. Okay, so suppose we only have one stock and it has different states. So in the next video, we'll deal with multiple stocks, starting with the most simple one, which is the two stock situation. And I'll see you there.